Alrighty, welcome to chapter 22, where we're talking about the lymphatic system. Here we'll start with the first third, going over kind of what the lymphatic system is and what is within its components. And then for the second half, the majority of this chapter, I shouldn't say half, we'll talk about the immune system, which is part of the lymphatic system. And this chapter tends to be a little confusing because it seems like, wow, there's like so many words. All the words kind of sound the same. Some things in the immune system actually have more than one name, and that makes it extra confusing. And so we'll try really hard here to make sure that things are crystal clear and straight to the point as much as possible. But in the meantime, I just wanted to suggest reading, not required by any means, but it might be useful for you, not necessarily for this course, but maybe for future courses whenever you talk about the immune system. This is written by someone who's actually also an instructor at a community college. And she writes it in a way that you don't have to read it from front to back in order to understand what's going on. You can just jump into whatever chapter is most relevant to you at the time and get a pretty good understanding of what's going on. Unfortunately, with the immune system, it's one of the newest systems that has really been understood and recognized by the medical community. And because of that, there's lots of different people naming it all sorts of different things. And every couple months or so, someone's like, oh, hey, well, we thought this cell does this, but actually it can do this now. We didn't know that before. And so that's part of the reason why it might be really confusing at first. But like I said, we'll try to really kind of get through the bare bones of the lymphatic system. So as usual, we have our purple slides here as a great review whenever you're done with the chapter. And before we really get going, I kind of just want to showcase a video of, let's see here, present on this device, there we go, of what's composed a lymphatic system. So here we should see a video of what I've used a complete anatomy for. And, oh, I think actually she's going to be talking, so let me increase volume here.
The lymphatic system is a multifunctional body system. Its roles include transportation of lymph and combating infection. The components of the lymphatic system include lymphatic vessels, lymph nodes, and lymphatic organs. Lymphatic vessels form an extensive network of thin-walled vessels that transport lymph around the body, eventually emptying it into the venous system. Lymphatic vessels contain numerous valves and have a beaded appearance bulging between adjacent valves when filled with lymph. Lymph nodes are small masses of lymphatic tissues situated along the course of the superficial and deep lymphatic vessels. Their function is to filter lymph as it passes through the lymphatic system en route to the venous system. Lymphatic organs are structures that produce lymphocytes and include the spleen and the thymus gland. Lymphocytes are white blood cells which circulate in the bloodstream and lymphatic system and are concentrated in lymph nodes. They are components of the immune system and have a role in combating infection.
Alrighty, so that was just meant to be a little bit of a brief introduction of what the lymphatic system looks like. I also highlight that video because I really wanted to point out the mass of the lymphatic system. Like it's everywhere. It is everywhere, and it is almost intimately next to or adjacent to a lot of major organs and structures in the body. So that's my main purpose for bringing that up in that video. So let's just go through a little bit more detail than what he introduced in that video. So first, the lymphatic system is transporting lymph. Lymph as a fluid is similar to plasma in the sense that it's pretty much water-based, but it has less proteins and more white blood cells. So the white blood cells are floating around and trying to help clear out debris, versus the blood plasma kind of just had a majority of proteins and antibodies and any other functional cellular proteins. Then we have those lymphatic vessels. Those were those long green chains that we could see in that video and also here in the picture from your book. Their purpose is to carry lymph from peripheral tissues and dump it straight into the veins, and we'll talk about that pathway a little bit later. We also have lymphoid tissues and organs, which we have primary lymphoid organs and secondary lymphoid organs and tissues, and we'll talk about those. And then we have lymphoid cells, like lymphocytes is what he was mentioning, and then we also have phagocytes, and we'll talk about what those mean as well. So the primary lymphoid tissues include the red bone marrow, which is in the bones, and then the thymus gland. And the thymus gland is just deep to the sternum in both males and females, and it's we'll talk more about how the thymus develops, but it will be where the T cells mature and become mature T cells, and the red bone marrow is where the B cells mature and become mature B cells. Then we also have secondary lymphoid tissue and organs. That includes the tonsils, MALT, which is mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue. We've got lymph nodes. We also have the spleen as well. And the spleen is where we're going to be cleaning out red blood cells and white blood cells and recycling their parts for so they can be reused again. Functions of the lymphatic system: make, maintain, and distribute lymphocytes for defense. So those lymphocytes are like our white blood cells. Again, another example of why the lymphatic system, lymphocytes, white blood cells, those mean the same thing, but we have two different names for them. Super fun. Also, the lymphatic system is responsible for teaching lymphocytes how to be good lymphocytes. We'll talk about how that works with B and T cells. And then help to maintain blood volume for redistributing extracellular fluid. And so we'll talk about this first before we really get into the immune system. So lymphatics, we call the entire structure, like we would call like the blood, the vessels of the of the cardiovascular system as vessels. We could say the lymphatics are the vessels of the lymphatic system. Lymph will enter into lymphatic capillaries, and then those capillaries will drain into major lymph ducts and or trunks, and then those trunks will eventually dump into the venous system, as he showed you in that video. The lymphatic capillaries themselves are closed at one end, so this means like instead of a blood vessel, like a vein or an artery, maybe it'll let me draw. Maybe not. Oh, it won't let me draw. Okay. So the lymphatics are going to be closed at one end, and this will build up pressure at that end, so that fluid, the lymph will move from the high to a lower pressure and will continuously keep flowing back towards the venous system. The lymphatic capillaries themselves are going to have a pretty large diameter and thin walls. Relatively speaking to blood capillaries, it'll be a little bit larger and a little bit thinner. They're typically flat or irregularly shaped, which is similar to the veins, but the veins still have a little bit of smooth muscle and they still have a little bit of shape to them versus the lymphatics. If there's no lymph in there, then they're just completely flat, not doing anything. They're also lined by endothelial cells with overlapping ends, just like the veins are, or the veins in the arteries are, except here they're overlapping, and then those overlaps are what actually help create those one-way valves, which was pictured in that video earlier as well. These one-way valves are really important because they'll help segment the buildup of lymph within the vessel and help continuously push it down through the tube. So just like kind of rolling a toothpaste tube, we're going to slowly, continuously push fluid back towards the heart, back into the venous system, and these valves are going to help us do that. The lymphatic capillaries themselves may or may not have a basement membrane, so that means they're not really directly attached to anything, they're just kind of floating around. And they're not going to be located in areas that do not have a blood supply. And a specific example of a specific type of lymphatic capillary that we'll see, and we'll talk about much more in detail when we get to the digestive system chapters, is a lacteal. And a lacteal is going to be right up next to an artery and a vein in the small intestine. And its purpose is to absorb any lipids that have been broken down as part of the digestive processes, and absorb that and transport it through not only the lymphatic system, but back into the venous system. And we'll talk about the purposes of that eventually, but that is a specific example where we have a lymphatic vessel that has a specialized name because it has a special process, and we call that a lacteal. Here's some pictures that your book gives you, some cartoonistic depictions of what's going on. So you've got an artery next to a vein, and then you can see that the arteries and veins are both opened on both directions, and you've got blood flow moving from a highly oxygenated area to a lesser oxygenated area, and then into the veins. And then the capillaries of the lymphatics are just kind of dancing around this structure as much as possible. So they're there to collect any extra fluids that either the capillaries, that the blood vasculature doesn't need anymore or is trying to get rid of, or any extra fluid that's in the interstitial space that doesn't need to be there, or any extra fluid that the tissues are getting rid of in general. We've got small lymphatic vessels. They're going to be, compared to capillaries, they're going to be a little bit bigger than capillaries. They have 3 layers. They'll have some valves like we mentioned as well. And pressure is going to be relatively low, if not 0. And eventually it'll push its way back through the lymphatics with those valves, where we were just talking about how they'll kind of segment and build up pressure and then push its way down, just like building up pressure with a toothpaste tube. And that's one way that we can actually help move fluid back into the venous drainage. But another way we can also do this is through something called a venae comitantes. And this is where we have an artery next to a vein, and the pulsating pressure of the smooth muscle in the artery will actually help push pressure against the vein and nearby lymphatics to help push lymph or blood in whatever direction they need to go. So as you can imagine, and that's what's kind of depicted here in the center picture, as blood is moving down through the arteries and lymphatics and venous fluid is trying to move back up towards the heart, the pressure will from the arteries will push its way down, and that pressure will push against the walls of the veins and the lymphatics and will help segment that fluid back up towards the heart. And then when the pressure's not there anymore, it'll kind of capture itself at one of those valves, and then wait for the next buildup of pressure before it can push its way back up to the heart. Then we have major lymphatic collecting vessels. We've got superficial lymphatics, which are going to get more of the superficial tissues, more near skin and hypodermis, and subcutaneous layers. Then those will dump into the deeper lymphatics, and those are going to be larger than the superficial lymphatics. And the deeper lymphatics are the ones that will actually run in parallel with arteries and veins, and those will all eventually dump into lymphatic trunks. And those lymphatic trunks are in 2 locations. One is the right lymphatic duct, and the other one is the thoracic duct. And the right lymphatic duct is really important because it's collecting blood from the right arm, right shoulder, right face, right neck, and right pectoral and shoulder region. And the thoracic duct is collecting blood from, collecting lymph from literally everywhere else. And then all of the lymphatics from the right side and the rest of the body will dump into the right lymphatic duct and the thoracic duct. This is super important to understand because a lot of times whenever someone has edema or a buildup of fluid somewhere and you're trying to move that fluid into another direction, you're trying to get rid of the buildup of pressure maybe in one limb, it's really important to understand the anatomy of where all these lymphatics are and where they drain to in order to help position patients better, like physically position them. So here in this picture, you can see the thoracic duct is in parallel with the inferior vena cava. Here we just cut the inferior vena cava so that you can see the thoracic duct much easier. And then that thoracic duct at the very end there is going to have something called a cisterna chyli, which is in the bottom right-hand corner here labeled. And the cisterna chyli is going to be the delta of getting into the thoracic duct and carrying all that lymph from the lower half of the body. And then the thoracic duct will carry all that blood back up to the superior vena cava, to the subclavian veins, and specifically the left subclavian vein. It'll dump directly into the left subclavian vein. Versus the right lymphatic duct is going to be collecting blood from, lymph fluid from that right arm, face, neck, like I mentioned, and dumping it into the right subclavian vein. And then all of that blood, as we know, goes down into the brachiocephalic veins, and then into the superior vena cava, and then into the right atrium, and so on and so forth. Okay, so just like I said, the thoracic duct, we have that cisterna chyli. Let's see here, anything else that I didn't mention? Nope, this is saying exactly what I just mentioned from that last slide. So now some terminology, lymphedema. So this is swelling of fluid, of lymphatic fluid. And another word for this, which is what that blank is called elephantitis. And the reason why I don't put pictures here is because if you Google elephantitis, There's some pictures that I'm sure are actually pictures of elephantitis, but they are a little obscene, and probably don't open them with your kids around. But it is very interesting. There can be a blockage of lymph at any of those lymphatic vessels, and that can put a lot of pressure and allow for a lot of fluid buildup in one area of the body. And this can be extremely painful sometimes. Sometimes it's not even felt at all, but it can be pretty gruesome, unfortunately, and patients can really suffer. So if you're interested, look up lymphedema pictures and elephantitis, which is, it's called elephantitis because it looks like, usually it's with the trunks of individuals, like one leg or both legs or both arms. And they look like elephant leg trunks, elephant legs, but then also like the texture of the elephant trunk itself, and so that's why that's why it's called elephantitis. Sometimes the way that this can actually be dealt with is with compression stockings, so that's what the picture here is on the right. Compression stockings are really helpful, especially for those who have poor circulation or might not have enough smooth muscle to actually help pump the fluid back into the venous system. And so these compression stockings will help build up more pressure and allow for that fluid to move more easily back up into the venous drainage. The reason why this is so hard is because essentially you're fighting against gravity. And as much as we don't really think about gravity on the day-to-day basis, it can be really, really difficult for a lot of fluid to have to fight against the pressures of gravity in order for it to move back up towards the heart. Like, that's a pretty long distance for fluid to travel on its own and just with the help of valves. So sometimes we need to add in a little bit more pressure for that fluid to move back. So can you recover or bounce back? Yes, typically, except it depends on how bad it's gotten, and a variety of things like age and elasticity and such. But sometimes they'll even just take other veins in the body or other lymphatics, and they'll redirect them so that fluid can move its way back in a normal fashion, or to provide more vessels in that area to help move even more fluid still in the same direction. Moving on, we have lymphoid cells like lymphoid cells like macrophages and microphages. These are typically the first line of defense whenever there is a pathogen in the body at whatever level. Macrophages are big eaters, microphages are small eaters. Then we have lymphocytes. Lymphocytes are more specific for T and B cells. So these are the lymphocytes that we learned were one of the 5 white blood cells. And then those lymphocytes can differentiate and become mature lymphocytes. And those mature lymphocytes come in 3 different flavors: T cells, B cells, and NK cells. We'll talk about T and B cells in detail, but NK cells are called natural killer cells. They're given this name because they are also one of the first lines of attack, and they will also essentially kill anything that's not labeled as one's self. And what does that mean? That's the whole purpose of the immune system, is to identify things that are not self within the body, so foreign pathogens, foreign bacteria, and be able to get rid of it in some fashion. So natural killer cells are usually one of the first on scene to do this. They'll work hand in hand with the macrophages and microphages, except they'll work a little differently in that they won't necessarily eat the pathogen. They will wait for a response from a certain receptor or nearby cells before they decide to eat a pathogen. And then we also have specific defenses and attacking mechanisms, which we'll talk about with the T and the B cells. We have some lymph nodules or lymph node nodules. These are baby lymph nodes, so they're not as big as lymph nodes, but they are small and they act similar to a lymph node. They're just not one of the major lymph nodes that we can really feel for. They are usually packed densely in one area, so like the axillary region, the inguinal region, the cervical region, areas like that. They'll also have a similar shape and build to what a big lymph node is, which includes having a center, and that center we call it a germinal center, and that's where we have these dividing lymphocytes. And those lymphocytes are eventually going to turn into the B and the T cells and go and do whatever the B and the T cells need to do. We also have tonsils, which are kind of like glorified lymph nodes. I don't really quite understand why we give them a more specific name like tonsil, and we don't just call them like super lymph nodes, but we call them tonsils. And we have 3 pairs of them on both sides, so 3 bilateral pairs. They're in the walls of the pharynx, in the so the back of the throat. And we have 1 pair of pharyngeal tonsils. These are also called adenoid tonsils, so you might have had your adenoids taken out as a kid, potentially after you had a large infection. We also have palatine tonsils, so these are going to be at the roof of the mouth, or near the roof of the mouth, but in the posterior aspect of the roof of the mouth. And we also have lingual tonsils. These are going to be inferior to the base of the tongue. Then we also have MALT, the mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, or lymphatic tissue. This is a collection of this lymphatic tissue that will be near areas that contain a lot of mucus. And the reason for this is because mucus tends to be in areas that are open to the external environment. So mouth, anus, reproductive tract, urinary tracts, ear, nose, mouth, throat, everything that could potentially have some sort of relationship with the outside environment will probably have some layer of mucosa. The mucosa is there because it's really basic, and like pH-wise, it's really basic, and most pathogens don't like living in a basic environment, number 1. Number 2, it's really slow, so it's kind of sticky. So like when the pathogen gets stuck there, it's not going to really be able to move very far very well. And so that gives it enough time for it to interact with the lymphatics, which are going to be right next to it, like this MALT, and we'll have those specific lymphocytes also buried near that mucosa that can come and immediately attack those pathogens, which makes this a very efficient process, allowing for these pathogens to be tackled kind of right at the entrance versus letting them kind of navigate around the body and then releasing some sort of defense mechanism against them. This is why it's so important to make sure that you take care of your mucosal linings. So putting sprays and cleaners in places that companies really want you to spend money buying their products to do that sort of thing in is really not necessary at all. So I'm talking about like some of those what are those nasal potty things, I'm forgetting the name of that, but those sprays that are supposed to help clean and drain out your sinuses. Unless a doctor really recommends that you do that, it's really unnecessary. There's a reason why you're congested. It's allowing for all of those lymphocytes to attack that pathogen and sequester it in that area versus allowing it to run away. Number 1. Number 2, using protective measures during different types of intercourse. So not only for the reproductive tract, but any other tracts, so including digestive tracts, both oral and both the mouth region and the anal region. These have a lot of mucosa in this area as well, and they need to be well lined with mucosa. So it's not safe to get rid of all of that mucosal lining because that actually will strip it of that protective layer and protective measure. So things like douching are just not going to help you in the long run, and they actually will strip away that mucus and those protective lymphocytes that are also in the MALT right next to those mucosal linings. All right, so enough of a little bit of sex ed. We can keep going. I'll probably bring this up again when we do get to the reproductive system chapter, so stay tuned. Okay, continuing on with the lymph nodes. The lymph nodes, their primary purpose is to filter. So we'll have a lymph node that will receive lymph from a couple different areas all at once, and then that lymph node will use its filtration power to clean out any pathogens or bacteria it may find, and then allow the rest of the lymph to pass through and continue on its journey. They're really purposeful because they kind of act as like early defense mechanisms, so similar to the MALT. So if MALT doesn't take care of it, then the lymph nodes will take care of it. And if the lymph nodes don't take care of it, then we'll talk about how the rest of the system kind of kicks in. But they're located in areas that are near large highways of lymphatics, and this allows for the greatest amount of contact to happen between all of that fluid and the lymph nodes itself. The lymph nodes also are a great place to allow for both T and B cells to hang out and wait for pathogens to just brush up next to them so they can attack them. It just kind of helps organize and streamline this entire process versus having like white blood cells floating around all the time aimlessly. It kind of helps bring the pathogen to the white blood cell versus having the white blood cell always have to try to search for it. We only make so many white blood cells, and they take a while for them to really mature and to become good at doing what they need to do. So we really need to have a good mechanism for giving them a way to do the job that they need to do, essentially. Here's a cartoonistic depiction of what the lymph node looks like, where you can see a bunch of afferents going into the lymph node and one efferent exiting out. So the afferents will bring in the lymph fluid that hasn't been filtered out, and the efferent will carry out the filtered lymph. And either it'll go back into another lymph node or it'll finally go back into the venous system. And the lymph node itself will have a cortex, a paracortex, and a medulla. And this picture makes it look really nice and organized and like, oh, look, if I slice through it, it looks really like, look, I can see the layers. And unfortunately, this is one of those organs that's not quite the case. Like all of the cartoonistic depictions make it look like it's this really nice, organized thing. But in reality, it's actually like folded in on itself. So if you were to slice through it, you wouldn't really be very clear on what section of the lymph node you're really looking at. But don't worry, for the purposes of this course, we're not going to do that to you. We'll focus on pictures that have been given by your book and on slides and things like that. But the cortex is where we'll have germinal centers that are filled with B cells. And then we have the medulla, which is the inside, and that'll also contain B cells, but it'll also have macrophages as well. And then the paracortex, para meaning around, and the paracortex will be surrounding those B cells with T cells. So essentially, you've brought all of the A gamers, the A team, A gamers, the A team to the center of the lymph node, and you're getting them ready to attack any pathogen that might be brushed up against them before they leave through the efferent vessel. All right, now we need to talk a little bit about some of the primary lymphoid organs like the thymus. And the thymus itself is present during early childhood, and then eventually over time it will atrophy or degrade and get smaller. And it's just deep to the sternum, like I mentioned earlier. It'll have a capsule that covers it, and it can be split into two different lobes, two lateral lobes. And each lobe is going to have its own medulla and cortex. And the medulla is going to be responsible for teaching T cells how to become their true T cell. And the way this really works is the thymus will wait around for the red bone marrow to make some premature T cells. And those T cells they're not true T cells yet. They don't know that they're even going to be T cells yet. They're just like, oh, I'm a white blood cell and I'm supposed to do something really important and I don't know what that is yet. And it just kind of floats around in the bloodstream, and then eventually it makes its way to the thymus gland. And in the thymus gland, all of these premature baby T cells kind of do this dance where they go into the medulla, out into the cortex, back into the medulla, out into the cortex. And they do this 2 or 3 times before the entire process is complete. And at the end of the process, we have T cells that actually are mature T cells, and they're like, oh, I'm a T cell, and I know that this is what I'm supposed to do, and that this is who I'm supposed to attack, and that I'm not supposed to attack anything that looks like me, and I'm not supposed to attack anything that looks like my body, and I'm ready, go ahead and release me. And then it gets released into the bloodstream and goes and acts like a T cell would normally act. Except during this entire process, about 90 to 95% of those pre-baby T cells actually don't even make it through the entire process. They fail. And it's a good thing that they fail, because the reason why they fail is they are taught during this like dancing back and forth, like, they're being tested. Do you know what a pathogen looks like? Yes. Okay, you can move on to the next step. Do you know what a non-pathogen looks like? Like, do you know who our friends are? Do you know who our foes are? And a lot of these T cells actually don't know who friend is versus foe. And if they mistakenly start attacking cells that are our own cells versus attacking non-self cells, then we start going into diseases called autoimmune diseases. Autoimmune, where we're attacking our own self. We're attacking our own immune system. And it's really important that 90 to 95% of those T cells actually don't make it through this process, so that those 5% that do are the ones that actually are able to do the job. And we're not going to talk about in detail in this course how that dance occurs, like the dance into the medulla, out to the cortex, back into the medulla, whatever. We're not going to talk about that in this course. Usually you'll go through that in a proper immune system course. But for here, I just kind of introduce that topic to you so that you really understand the importance of the thymus gland. Also, in addition to that story where it goes into the thymus or into the medulla, out into the cortex, and blah blah blah, that whole thing is directed by the thymosin hormone. So we need that thymosin hormone in order to help direct these cells to the right area, in order for them to be tested to see if they are going to be good T cells or not at the end of the day. Here's some pictures of where that thymus gland is, a cartoonistic depiction of it. Then as you move to the right and then down, if we look at a cross-section in the under the scope, we can see that we have that cortex and the medulla. And if we were to zoom in even further, we could see these thymic corpuscles. And these thymic corpuscles kind of look like little hurricane centers. That's how I always am able to identify the thymus versus some of the other glands, is they're going to have these hurricane centers in there. And those hurricane centers are where we're going to have that specialization of those cells actually happening. So this is where that T cell really learns to become a T cell. Moving on to the spleen. So the spleen is one of our secondary lymphoid organs. Like I said, its purpose is to recycle the properties of the red blood cell and the white blood cell after it's done being used. So things that it might want to recycle, we've already talked about for the red blood cells, but for the white blood cells, it may be some of the DNA material that's used to actually make sure that that cell propagates and makes a new cell that's very similar to it. Maybe it was very good at attacking a certain pathogen and we need more of that cell, so maybe we want to hold on to some of those DNA molecules or protein molecules. It's also responsible for containing two different types of pulp, red pulp and white pulp. Red pulp is where we'll actually take care of those red blood cells. So that's why it's called red, is because it looks red under the microscope. And that's due to the bilirubin buildup in there. And macrophages are going to initiate the process of breaking down those red blood cells. Then we have white pulp. White pulp is going to take care of those white blood cells. And again, initiated by some macrophages, but eventually we break down those lymphocytes. The spleen itself, if you see a really enlarged spleen for some reason, that probably means that there's a large amount of red blood cells and white blood cells, maybe both, maybe one or the other. And for whatever reason, there were too many red blood cells or too many white blood cells in that body, and there wasn't enough time for the spleen to really take care of breaking down those cell properties. And so there was a buildup of all of this used red blood cell and white blood cell area, and that just made the spleen expand. So then if the spleen expands, it makes it much easier for it to burst, number one, which is not the greatest situation. Number two, its location also makes it really, makes it really risky or really likely for it to actually be damaged during specific types of accidents, specifically like car accidents. People tend to have their spleen burst or their spleen rupture just because of its location. So it's on the left side, just deep and posterior and slightly inferior to the stomach, but still superior to the kidney. So in that area, you have the rest of the thoracic cage kind of circling around it, but there's that tail end of it that doesn't quite capture really any or much of the spleen itself. And so that leaves it pretty open to the environment to take those that hit. Can you live without a spleen? Yes. Splenectomy would be the removal of a spleen. However, you still need some way of recycling your red blood cells and your white blood cells. So it's not an easy life to live, but it is possible. So here's a picture of the spleen, again from left to right and then down, a transverse plane of where the spleen would be. It's flipped. Oh, sorry, I was confused here for a second. So it's flipped around so that the, am I blind? Shape of the spleen. Yep, that's a vertebrae. Those are some kidneys. Okay, so I apologize. I misspoke in the previous slide. I think I said left side, but I meant right side. Nope, I do not mean right side. I mean left side. I'm struggling with the picture of this. They must be at a different plane that I don't understand. Okay, I'm not gonna, I could spend hours looking at this picture. All right, so the picture on the left where you can see the man and you can see the transverse plane there and you can see the spleen highlighted just posterior to the stomach. So yes, left side. Then in the picture below, you can see the difference between the white pulp versus the red pulp. Make sure to be able to feel comfortable identifying the difference between the two in an image. The white pulp, yes, will look more white, but not like a true bright white. It will just look more white than the red pulp will. And then a cartoonistic depiction of the spleen in the bottom left corner. And we can see coming into and out of the spleen blood vessels and lymphatics. And right where all three of those come together is a hilum. So that's the hilum of the spleen. That's it for this section.